Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in American frontier history. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time you're listening to this narration. We're interested to know to what places and at what moments of day or night these documented accounts reach. In the autumn of 1855, in the remote mining settlement of Hangtown, California, a story unfolded that would challenge everything the frontier community believed about love, loyalty, and justice. What began as a simple tale of widowhood and remarriage would reveal itself as something far more sinister, a carefully orchestrated deception that spanned 3 years and involved the calculated murder of a prosperous gold miner. The case centers on Mary Elizabeth Johnson, a 23-year-old woman who arrived in California from Missouri in 1852, and William Carter, a drifter whose past remained deliberately obscure to those who knew him. Between them lay the body of Thomas Johnson, Mary's first husband, whose death in 1855 appeared to be nothing more than another mining accident in a region where such tragedies occurred with grim regularity. But Thomas Johnson's death was no accident, and the woman who mourned him so publicly would, within 6 months, marry the very man who had orchestrated his murder. What makes this case particularly disturbing is not simply the crime itself, but the methodical way in which it was planned and executed, and the chilling normalcy with which the perpetrators resumed their lives afterward. The story emerged through fragments discovered decades later, a collection of letters found in 1868 during the demolition of an old boarding house, diary entries that contradicted official records, and testimony from witnesses who had remained silent for over a decade. These documents, now archived in the California State Library's manuscript collection, paint a picture of premeditated murder disguised as frontier romance. Hangtown in 1855 was a settlement clinging to the eastern slopes of the Sierra Nevada, its population swelling and contracting with the fortunes of the nearby placer mines. The town had acquired its grim nickname from the frequency with which justice was administered from the branches of an ancient oak tree that stood in the center of what passed for a main street. It was a place where men disappeared regularly, where questions were rarely asked, and where the line between legal and illegal enterprise blurred with the moral flexibility that characterized much of Gold Rush, California. Thomas Johnson had arrived in Hangtown during the early months of 1853, one of thousands drawn by reports of easy gold waiting to be plucked from the streams and hillsides of the region. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Johnson possessed both the capital and the patience necessary for sustained mining operations. He had invested in proper equipment, hired reliable workers, and established a claim along Coyote Creek that proved modestly but consistently profitable. Johnson was described by those who knew him as a methodical man, careful with his money and conservative in his habits. He neither drank to excess nor gambled away his earnings, behaviors that set him apart from many of his fellow miners. By the standards of frontier California, he was prosperous. By the standards of the world he had left behind in Illinois, he was wealthy beyond anything he might have reasonably expected. It was this prosperity that first attracted the attention of Mary Elizabeth Patterson, as she was known before her marriage to Johnson. Mary had arrived in California as part of a wagon train organized by families from Clay County, Missouri, families seeking opportunity in the gold fields or in the businesses that served the miners. Unlike many women who came to California during this period, Mary traveled alone, claiming to be recently widowed. Though no records exist to verify the existence or death of a first husband, Mary was striking rather than beautiful, possessed of the kind of sharp intelligence that expressed itself in an ability to assess people and situations with uncomfortable accuracy. She had pale blue eyes that seemed to catalogue details others missed, and she carried herself with a confidence that some found attractive and others found unsettling. In a region where women were scarce and marriages often occurred within weeks of first meeting, Mary's deliberate approach to courtship was noteworthy. She spent the better part of a year evaluating the prospects available to her in Hangtown and the surrounding mining camps. She attended church services, social gatherings, and community events with the systematic approach of someone conducting business rather than seeking romance. Thomas Johnson became her target not because of any particular personal attraction, but because he represented the best combination of current wealth and future prospects among the available men. The courtship, such as it was, lasted 4 months. Johnson, lonely and approaching his 31st birthday, was flattered by the attention of a younger woman who seemed genuinely interested in his plans and ambitions. Mary encouraged his confidences about his mining operations, his financial arrangements with the local assay office, and his intentions to eventually return to Illinois once he had accumulated sufficient capital. They were married in November 1853 by a traveling preacher who recorded the ceremony in a registry that would later be lost in a fire. The marriage appeared successful by the standards of the frontier community. Mary proved to be an efficient housekeeper and a supportive wife. She showed interest in Johnson's work, sometimes accompanying him to the mining site, and she integrated herself into the social life of the settlement with apparent ease. What the community did not know was that Mary had begun corresponding with William Carter within 3 weeks of her marriage to Thomas Johnson. William Carter had arrived in Hangtown during the winter of 1854. Another drifter drawn by stories of easy wealth, but Carter was different from the typical fortune seeker. He was older, probably in his early 40s, though he claimed to be younger. He had the kind of weathered appearance that suggested hard living, and there was something about his manner that made people uncomfortable without being able to explain exactly why. Carter took a job at the general store, work that put him in contact with most of the local population and gave him access to information about their business affairs. He was observant and patient, qualities that served him well in his role as informal town gossip and information broker. He learned who was prospering, who was struggling, who owed money, and who had money to lend. He also learned about Thomas and Mary Johnson. More specifically, he learned about Mary Johnson's growing dissatisfaction with her marriage and her interest in exploring alternatives. The first letter between Mary and Carter, discovered in 1868, was dated January 22, 1854, less than 3 months after her wedding. The letter was carefully worded, discussing business matters and community news, but it contained undertones that suggested a more intimate relationship was developing. Subsequent letters, found hidden in the same location, documented the evolution of what appeared to be both a romantic affair and a business partnership. By spring of 1854, Mary and Carter had begun meeting secretly. The meetings took place in an abandoned mining shack approximately 2 miles upstream from Johnson's claim, a location that provided both privacy and a reasonable explanation for their presence in the area should they be discovered. Mary told her husband she was collecting wild herbs for medicinal purposes, a hobby that provided cover for her frequent absences. The relationship between Mary and Carter was not simply romantic. The letters reveal a calculating partnership focused on identifying the best method for eliminating Thomas Johnson while minimizing risk to themselves. They considered various options: a mining accident, food poisoning, a staged robbery. Each possibility was analyzed for its practicality and its likelihood of attracting unwanted attention from the community or territorial authorities. The method they eventually chose was both simple and cruel. Johnson would die from what appeared to be an accidental cave-in at his mining site. The collapse would be real, triggered by Carter, who would ensure that Johnson was positioned in the mine shaft when the supporting timbers gave way. Mary would establish an alibi by being visibly present in town during the time of the accident, and Carter would be among the first to respond to her cries for help when the body was discovered. The plan required extensive preparation. Carter spent months studying the construction of Johnson's mine, identifying the supporting beams that could be weakened without causing immediate collapse. He visited the site regularly, ostensibly to deliver supplies or discuss business matters, but actually to prepare the mechanism that would trigger the cave-in. Mary's role was equally important. She needed to establish patterns of behavior that would support her story, while also ensuring that Johnson would be in the correct location at the predetermined time. This required her to take an increased interest in her husband's mining operations, to suggest improvements and modifications that would position him in the most dangerous part of the mine during his regular inspection routine. The letters between Mary and Carter during the months leading up to the murder reveal the psychological toll of their deception. Both experienced periods of doubt and anxiety, but both were sustained by their shared vision of a future together, funded by Thomas Johnson's accumulated wealth. They had identified specific banks where Johnson kept his money, located the hiding places where he kept gold dust and nuggets in their cabin, and planned the story they would tell about Mary's need to liquidate assets quickly in order to leave California after her husband's tragic death. On the morning of July 15, 1855, Mary Johnson prepared breakfast for her husband, as she had done every morning for nearly 2 years. She kissed him goodbye as he left for his mine, knowing it would be the last time she would see him alive. She spent the day in town, making purchases at the general store where Carter worked, visiting with other women, and making herself visible to as many people as possible. Thomas Johnson died at approximately 2:30 that afternoon, when the roof of his mine collapsed. The sound of the cave-in was heard by workers at a neighboring claim, who rushed to investigate. They found Johnson trapped beneath heavy timbers and tons of earth, his body crushed by the weight of the mountain he had been trying to persuade to yield its gold. William Carter was among the first to reach the scene, arriving even before the workers from the adjacent mine had finished their initial assessment. He took charge of the rescue effort, directing the placement of supports and the removal of debris with the kind of expertise that seemed natural in a man who had worked in mines before coming to California. His efforts appeared heroic, and his obvious distress at being unable to save Thomas Johnson seemed genuine to those who witnessed it. Mary Johnson's reaction to news of her husband's death was described as appropriate but controlled. She wept, but not excessively. She accepted condolences gracefully, and she made practical arrangements for her husband's burial with the kind of efficiency that suggested strength rather than callousness. The community admired her composure and interpreted her behavior as evidence of frontier fortitude rather than guilty indifference. The funeral was held 3 days after the accident. Thomas Johnson was buried in the small cemetery on the hill above Hangtown, his grave marked by a wooden cross bearing his name and the dates of his birth and death. Mary wore black, as was expected, and she accepted the sympathy of the community with appropriate dignity. William Carter attended the service, standing apart from the other mourners, his presence unremarkable in a community where most residents attended funerals regardless of their personal relationship with the deceased. Within a week of the funeral, Mary announced her intention to sell Thomas's mining claim and other assets. She explained that she could not bear to remain in a place where every sight reminded her of her loss, and that she planned to return to her family in Missouri as soon as her affairs could be arranged. The community understood this decision, and several men offered to assist her in disposing of property that might be difficult for a woman to handle alone. William Carter was among those who offered assistance. His involvement seemed natural, given his work at the general store and his knowledge of local business practices. He helped Mary negotiate the sale of mining equipment, advised her on fair prices for the various assets left by her husband, and generally served as the kind of masculine support that a widow might reasonably require in a frontier settlement. What the community did not observe was that Carter was also helping Mary conceal, rather than liquidate, a significant portion of Thomas Johnson's wealth. Gold dust worth several $1,000s was quietly removed from its hiding places and stored in locations that Carter had prepared. Cash that had been deposited in the local assay office was withdrawn and converted into forms that would be easier to transport. Valuable personal possessions were packed and shipped, not to Missouri, but to addresses in Sacramento and San Francisco that Carter had arranged. The relationship between Mary and Carter during this period remained carefully concealed. They met only when necessary for legitimate business purposes, and their interactions in public were formal and appropriate. Carter continued to live in his boarding house room, and Mary remained in the cabin she had shared with Thomas. To observers, they appeared to be simply a helpful neighbor and a grateful widow, their relationship bounded by the requirements of practical necessity. This careful deception continued for 3 months. During this time, Mary completed the sale of all visible assets connected to her late husband's estate. She announced that she had booked passage on a stagecoach that would take her to Sacramento, where she would board a steamship for San Francisco and eventually return to Missouri. The community prepared to bid farewell to a woman who had demonstrated admirable strength in the face of tragedy. But Mary Johnson did not board the stagecoach to Sacramento. On the morning of her scheduled departure, she was discovered to have vanished from her cabin, leaving behind only a note explaining that she had decided to travel by a different route in order to avoid painful memories associated with the main roads. Her personal possessions were gone, but the cabin showed no signs of struggle or forced entry. The community assumed she had simply changed her travel plans without feeling the need to explain her decision to people who were, after all, only temporary neighbors in her life. William Carter's disappearance was discovered 2 days later. He failed to appear for work at the general store, and when his landlord investigated, his room was found to be empty of personal possessions. The landlord assumed Carter had quit his job and moved on, a common occurrence in a transient community where people regularly departed without notice. It was not immediately obvious to anyone in Hangtown that the departures of Mary Johnson and William Carter might be related. The two had maintained such careful distance in their public interactions that few people thought of them as anything more than casual acquaintances. Even when some residents began to comment on the coincidental timing of their departures, the general assumption was that both had simply decided that Hangtown no longer offered them what they were seeking. This assumption was reinforced when letters began arriving for various residents, letters that had been posted from Sacramento and bearing Mary Johnson's signature. The letters thanked people for their kindness during her time of loss and announced that she had safely reached San Francisco, where she was staying with friends before continuing to Missouri. The letters seemed to confirm that Mary had indeed left California and was proceeding with her original plans. What the recipients of these letters did not know was that they had been written by Mary before her departure, given to Carter to post from Sacramento, and sent at intervals calculated to maintain the illusion that Mary was following her stated itinerary. The truth was that Mary Johnson and William Carter had traveled not to Sacramento, but north to Oregon Territory, where they established themselves in a small farming community near Portland. They assumed new identities, presenting themselves as Charles and Margaret Willis, a married couple from Ohio, seeking fresh opportunities in the Oregon country. They had sufficient capital to purchase a modest farm and integrate themselves into a community where questions about past history were rarely asked. The deception was nearly perfect. Mary and Carter had executed their plan with methodical precision. eliminating the only person who could threaten their future together while acquiring the means to live comfortably under new identities. They had avoided the obvious mistakes that typically exposed such crimes. There was no evidence of planning, no suspicious behavior before the murder, no hasty departure that might suggest guilt. Even the selection of Oregon as their destination showed careful thought, since it was distant enough to reduce the chance of recognition, but accessible enough to be reached without creating a suspicious travel record. But perfection in crime, like perfection in any human endeavor, is nearly impossible to maintain indefinitely. The first crack in their carefully constructed story appeared in 1857, nearly 2 years after Thomas Johnson's death. A man named Samuel Parker, who had worked briefly as a miner in Hangtown during 1855, encountered the couple calling themselves Charles and Margaret Willis while conducting business in Portland. Parker had known both Mary and Carter during his time in Hangtown, though not well, and he was startled to discover them living together as husband and wife. Parker was not particularly concerned about the moral implications of their relationship, nor did he immediately suspect criminal behavior. But he was curious enough to make discreet inquiries among other former Hangtown residents who might have information about what had happened to Mary Johnson and William Carter. These inquiries eventually reached someone who remembered the timing of their departures and began to wonder whether there might be more to the story than had been apparent at the time. The questioning that followed was informal and gradual. No one suspected murder, but there was growing curiosity about why two people who had supposedly departed Hangtown separately should now be living together as husband and wife in Oregon. This curiosity led to more detailed examination of the events surrounding Thomas Johnson's death, and gradually inconsistencies began to emerge. The first significant discovery was made by accident. In 1858, flooding along Coyote Creek washed out several mining claims, including the site where Thomas Johnson had died. The flood scoured away earth and debris that had accumulated over 3 years, exposing portions of the collapsed mine that had been buried since the accident. Among the debris that was revealed were pieces of mining timber that showed evidence of deliberate cutting rather than natural failure. The discovery attracted the attention of current miners working in the area, who examined the exposed timbers and concluded that the cave-in that killed Thomas Johnson had been artificially triggered. The cuts were clean and purposeful, positioned to ensure maximum structural failure when weight was applied to specific points. Someone with considerable knowledge of mine construction had carefully sabotaged the supports in a way that would create a catastrophic collapse while appearing to be accidental. This discovery prompted a more thorough investigation of the circumstances surrounding Johnson's death. Local residents began to reconsider events they had witnessed or heard about during the summer of 1855. Details that had seemed unremarkable at the time took on new significance when viewed as potential evidence of premeditated murder. One of the most important witnesses was Mrs. Eleanor Patterson, who operated a boarding house in Hangtown and who had observed much of the daily life of the settlement. Mrs. Patterson recalled that William Carter had shown unusual interest in Thomas Johnson's mining operations, asking detailed questions about the construction of the mine and the schedule Johnson followed in conducting his work. At the time, such questions had seemed natural from someone working at the general store, since Carter often delivered supplies to various mining claims. In light of the evidence of sabotage, Carter's interest appeared more sinister. Mrs. Patterson also recalled seeing Mary Johnson and William Carter together on several occasions when they had claimed to be conducting separate business in town. Again, these observations had seemed unremarkable at the time, but they took on new meaning when considered as evidence of a secret relationship. The most damaging testimony came from a Chinese laborer named Chen Wei, who had worked periodically at various mining claims in the area. Chen Wei had excellent English and served as an interpreter and negotiator between Chinese workers and American mine owners. In this capacity, he had become familiar with many of the mining operations along Coyote Creek, including Thomas Johnson's claim. Chen Wei recalled that William Carter had visited Johnson's mine frequently during the months before the collapse. Often when Johnson was not present, Carter had claimed to be conducting business for the general store, but Chen Wei had noticed that Carter spent considerable time examining the mine structure rather than simply delivering supplies or messages. Chen Wei had also observed Carter making measurements and taking notes, behavior that seemed unusual for someone whose purpose was simply commercial. More significantly, Chen Wei had been present at a neighboring claim on the day of the cave-in and had heard the collapse occur. According to Chen Wei, there had been two distinct sounds. A sharp crack followed immediately by the rumble of falling earth. The initial crack, Chen Wei believed, was too precise and sudden to be the result of natural structural failure. It sounded, he said, like the breaking of wood that had been cut nearly through and then subjected to sudden pressure. These testimonies, combined with the physical evidence revealed by the flood, created a compelling case for murder. But building a legal case required more than suspicion and circumstantial evidence. It required locating Mary Johnson and William Carter and proving their involvement in Thomas Johnson's death. The search for the couple led investigators to Oregon Territory, where the inquiries made by Samuel Parker had already established their presence. Local authorities in Portland were contacted and asked to investigate the couple known as Charles and Margaret Willis. The investigation revealed that they owned a small farm about 20 miles outside the city, that they lived quietly and attracted little attention from their neighbors, and that they appeared to possess financial resources that exceeded what might be expected from farming operations. Further investigation revealed that Margaret Willis bore a strong physical resemblance to descriptions of Mary Johnson, and that Charles Willis possessed skills and knowledge consistent with William Carter's background. But physical resemblance and general skills were not sufficient evidence for legal action, particularly since the couple had been living peacefully in Oregon for over 3 years and were regarded as respectable members of their community. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source. In early 1859, a woman named Rose McKenna arrived in Portland claiming to be Mary Johnson's sister. McKenna had traveled from Missouri after receiving letters allegedly sent by Mary from California. Letters that had convinced her that something was wrong with her sister's situation. McKenna had last heard from Mary in 1856, and subsequent letters had seemed increasingly unlike Mary's usual writing style and content. McKenna was able to provide detailed information about Mary's background, including personal details that had never been recorded in official documents. She also brought with her examples of Mary's handwriting, including letters that Mary had sent to family members before leaving Missouri. Comparison of this handwriting with documents known to have been created by Margaret Willis showed significant similarities, but also subtle differences that suggested either an attempt at disguise or the influence of stress and time. More importantly, Rose McKenna was able to identify specific physical characteristics that could definitively establish whether Margaret Willis was actually Mary Johnson. Mary had a distinctive scar on her left hand, the result of a childhood accident, and she had a birthmark on her neck that was usually concealed by clothing. These identifying marks would be visible upon close examination and would provide conclusive evidence of identity. Arranging such an examination required careful planning, since any direct approach would alert the couple to the investigation and possibly prompt them to flee again. Local authorities decided to create a situation that would bring Margaret Willis into contact with officials in a context that would not arouse suspicion. The opportunity arose when the couple's farm was selected for inclusion in a county agricultural survey being conducted during the summer of 1859. The survey was legitimate, designed to assess farming practices and crop yields throughout the region, but it provided cover for officials to visit the farm and interact with its owners. Among the survey team was Dr. James Morrison, a physician who had been briefed about the identifying marks they were seeking to observe. The visit took place on a warm July afternoon. The survey team was welcomed by Charles and Margaret Willis, who appeared to be a normal farming couple, eager to cooperate with official inquiries about their agricultural practices. Margaret Willis was friendly and helpful, providing detailed information about crop yields and farming techniques. During the conversation, she unconsciously adjusted her sleeves in a way that briefly revealed the scar on her left hand. Later, when she served refreshments to the visitors, she bent over the table in a manner that allowed Dr. Morrison to observe the birthmark on her neck. Both identifying marks were exactly as Rose McKenna had described them. Margaret Willis was definitely Mary Johnson, the widow of the murdered miner Thomas Johnson. Armed with this positive identification, authorities were able to obtain warrants for the arrest of both Mary Johnson and William Carter on charges of conspiracy to commit murder and murder in the first degree. The arrests were carried out on August 3, 1859, nearly 4 years after the death of Thomas Johnson. The couple's reaction to the arrests provided additional evidence of their guilt. William Carter immediately began trying to negotiate, offering to provide information about Mary's role in the crime in exchange for reduced charges against himself. Mary Johnson maintained her innocence, but became visibly distressed when confronted with evidence that investigators had discovered the letters documenting her relationship with Carter and their planning of her husband's murder. The letters had been discovered during a search of the abandoned mining shack where Mary and Carter had conducted their secret meetings. The shack had been used by various miners over the years since 1855, and most of its contents had been removed or destroyed. But the letters had been hidden in a leather pouch that had been concealed beneath loose floorboards in one corner of the building. The pouch had been forgotten or deliberately left behind when Mary and Carter fled California, and it remained undiscovered until investigators conducted a systematic search of locations where the couple might have hidden evidence. The letters provided devastating evidence of premeditation and conspiracy. They documented the evolution of the relationship between Mary and Carter, their analysis of various methods for killing Thomas Johnson, their detailed planning of the mining accident, and their arrangements for disposing of Johnson's assets and establishing new identities. The letters were in Mary's handwriting, and many contained intimate details that could only have been known to her. Equally damaging was Carter's obvious familiarity with Mary's background and personal history, knowledge that could only have been obtained through extended intimate contact. When questioned separately, both Mary and Carter provided identical details about Thomas Johnson's daily routines, his financial arrangements, and his future plans. Information that supported the theory that they had been working together to gather intelligence necessary for planning his murder. The trial began in October 1859 and attracted considerable attention throughout Oregon Territory and California. The case was unusual not only because of the brutal nature of the crime, but because it involved a woman accused of murdering her husband in order to marry her lover. Such cases were rare in frontier communities, where women were generally viewed as civilizing influences rather than sources of violent crime. The prosecution's case was methodical and comprehensive. They presented the physical evidence of sabotage discovered at the mining site, the testimony of witnesses who had observed suspicious behavior by both defendants, the letters documenting their relationship and planning, and expert testimony about the deliberate nature of the mine collapse. They also established a clear timeline showing that Mary and Carter had opportunity to plan and execute the crime, and they demonstrated that both had benefited financially from Thomas Johnson's death. The defense strategy focused on challenging the authenticity of the letters and questioning the reliability of witness testimony given years after the events in question. Carter's attorney argued that his client had been manipulated by Mary Johnson, who had initiated the relationship and conceived the murder plot. Mary's attorney argued that the letters were forgeries and that the similarities between Mary Johnson and Margaret Willis were purely coincidental. Neither defense strategy was successful. Handwriting experts confirmed that the letters were genuine, and the accumulation of evidence made coincidence seem impossible. More damaging to the defendants was their behavior during the trial, which suggested guilt rather than innocence. Carter repeatedly attempted to minimize his own responsibility while implicating Mary, behavior that undermined his credibility with the jury. Mary maintained her innocence, but appeared cold and calculating in her responses to questioning, creating an impression that reinforced prosecution arguments about her capacity for premeditated murder. The trial lasted 12 days. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning verdicts of guilty on all charges for both defendants. Judge Samuel Crawford sentenced both Mary Johnson and William Carter to death by hanging, the sentences to be carried out within 60 days. The executions took place on December 21st, 1859, in the courtyard of the Territorial Prison in Portland. Both defendants maintained their innocence to the end, but their claims were undermined by additional evidence that emerged during their time in prison. Fellow inmates reported that Carter had described details of the murder that had not been introduced during the trial, and that Mary had spoken bitterly about her dead husband's lack of ambition and his failure to accumulate wealth quickly enough to satisfy her expectations. The case attracted attention from newspapers throughout the Western Territories, and accounts of the trial and executions were reprinted in publications as distant as New York and Boston. Editorial writers used the case to explore themes of frontier justice, the changing role of women in American society, and the corrupting influence of gold rush wealth on moral behavior. But for the residents of Hangtown, the resolution of the case provided little satisfaction. Thomas Johnson remained dead, and the community was left to confront the unsettling reality that they had lived for years among people capable of carefully planned murder. The knowledge that such calculated evil could exist behind facades of respectability created a lasting sense of unease that changed the character of the settlement. The mine where Thomas Johnson died was never reopened. Local miners avoided the site, claiming that it was unlucky, and gradually the forest reclaimed the scarred hillside where Johnson had sought his fortune. By 1865, few traces remained of the mining operation that had cost Johnson his life and led to the exposure of one of the most calculating crimes in gold rush history. The cabin where Mary and Thomas Johnson had lived was sold and later demolished. The general store where William Carter had worked changed hands several times before closing permanently when the local mining boom ended in the mid-1860s. The boarding house where Carter had lived was converted to private residences and eventually torn down to make way for more modern construction. Today, only the cemetery remains to mark Thomas Johnson's connection to Hangtown. His grave, marked by a stone monument erected by the territorial government in 1860, bears a simple inscription recording his name, dates of birth and death, and the phrase, "murdered by those who should have protected him." The monument serves as a reminder of the capacity for evil that can exist beneath the surface of even the most ordinary relationships, and of the price paid by those who trust too easily in the goodness of others. The case of Mary Johnson and William Carter represents more than simply another frontier murder. It illustrates the complex ways in which greed, manipulation, and premeditation can combine to create devastating consequences for innocent victims. It also demonstrates how carefully constructed deceptions can persist for years before being exposed. and how the pursuit of justice sometimes requires extraordinary persistence and attention to detail. Perhaps most disturbing is the evidence that Mary and Carter were able to live comfortably for nearly 4 years after committing their crime, establishing new identities and integrating themselves into a respectable community while their victim lay forgotten in a distant grave. Their ability to maintain normal appearances while carrying such a terrible secret suggests a level of psychological detachment that challenges assumptions about the nature of guilt and conscience. The letters that ultimately exposed their crime provide a unique window into the minds of two people planning and executing murder. The correspondence reveals not monsters, but recognizable human beings whose desires for wealth and security led them to rationalize increasingly extreme actions. Their careful planning and methodical execution of the crime demonstrate that evil often manifests itself not as sudden passion, but as deliberate choice sustained over time. For Rose McKenna, who had traveled across the continent to discover the truth about her sister, the resolution brought both closure and permanent grief. She had learned that Mary was alive, but in learning this, she had also discovered that her sister was capable of murder. McKenna remained in Oregon for several weeks after the executions, attempting to understand how the woman she remembered as a loving sister had become someone capable of such calculated cruelty. The financial aspects of the crime were never fully resolved. Much of Thomas Johnson's wealth disappeared and was never recovered, presumably hidden by Mary and Carter in locations that died with them. Efforts to trace their financial transactions in Oregon revealed some assets, but the bulk of the stolen money was never found. It may remain buried somewhere in the mountains of California or Oregon, a hidden treasure that represents the final secret carried by two people who chose murder as the path to prosperity. The impact on Hangtown itself was profound and lasting. The community that had prided itself on frontier justice and mutual support was forced to confront the reality that it had been completely deceived by two of its residents. The knowledge that careful planning and patient deception could overcome the informal networks of observation and gossip that typically provided security in small communities created a sense of vulnerability that persisted long after the immediate drama of the case had ended. Some residents left Hangtown in the aftermath of the revelations, claiming that they could no longer feel safe in a place where such deception had been possible. Others remained, but adopted a more guarded approach to relationships with newcomers, subjecting strangers to more careful scrutiny and maintaining greater emotional distance until trust could be established over time. The story of Mary Johnson and William Carter serves as a reminder that the frontier experience, often romanticized in popular culture, included not only adventure and opportunity, but also isolation, vulnerability, and exposure to human evil in its most calculating forms. The vast spaces and loose social structures that provided freedom for legitimate pursuits also created opportunities for those whose intentions were murderous. And in the end, perhaps that is the most chilling aspect of this case. Not that such crimes occurred, but that they could occur so easily, concealed for so long by people who appeared so normal. The face of evil, as Thomas Johnson discovered too late, often wears the mask of love. The records of the case were sealed by territorial authorities in 1860, filed away in archives that would not be opened again until the 20th century. The decision to restrict access was made partly out of respect for the families affected, but also because officials recognized that the methodical nature of the crime might inspire imitators if the details became widely known. For decades, the case existed only in whispered stories told by older residents who remembered the events. These oral accounts became increasingly distorted over time, transforming Mary Johnson and William Carter from calculated killers into folk villains possessed of supernatural cunning. The truth, preserved in official documents, was far more disturbing than the legends that replaced it. In 1923, a graduate student named Robert Hayes discovered the sealed files while researching territorial court records at the Oregon State Archives. Hayes was studying frontier justice systems, and the Johnson-Carter case represented exactly the kind of methodical investigation and legal process he was documenting. He petitioned for permission to examine the complete file, and after considerable deliberation, authorities granted limited access. Hayes's resulting thesis, completed in 1925, provided the first scholarly analysis of the case. His work confirmed the essential accuracy of the trial testimony and revealed additional details that had been withheld from newspaper accounts during the original proceedings. Most significantly, Hayes discovered evidence that suggested Mary Johnson and William Carter may have committed similar crimes before arriving in California. Among the papers in Carter's possession at the time of his arrest were letters from contacts in Kansas and Nebraska, letters that referenced previous business arrangements and expressed satisfaction with outcomes that had exceeded expectations. The letters were carefully worded to avoid explicit admissions, but they suggested that Carter had been involved in activities that required careful planning and produced substantial financial rewards. More disturbing were notations found in Mary's personal effects, notations that appeared to be character assessments of various men she had encountered during her travels to California. The assessments included detailed information about financial resources, family connections, and personal habits, information that would be valuable to someone evaluating potential targets for exploitation or worse. Hayes concluded that the murder of Thomas Johnson was probably not Mary and Carter's first collaborative crime, but rather the culmination of a criminal partnership that had been developing over several years. His thesis suggested that the couple had refined their methods through previous experiences, which explained the sophisticated planning and near-perfect execution of their California operation. Hayes's work remained buried in academic archives for 40 years, known only to specialists in frontier history. It was rediscovered in 1965 by a true crime writer named Margaret Sterling, who incorporated Hayes's research into a book about unsolved murders in the American West. Sterling's book brought the Johnson-Carter case to public attention for the first time since the 1859 trial, and it sparked renewed interest in examining other unexplained deaths that had occurred in areas where Mary and Carter were known to have traveled. That examination revealed a pattern of suspicious deaths stretching from Missouri to Oregon, deaths that shared common characteristics: male victims who had accumulated modest wealth, deaths that appeared accidental or natural, and subsequent disappearances of women who had been associated with the victims. None of the individual cases had attracted sufficient attention to prompt thorough investigation, but viewed collectively, they suggested a criminal enterprise that had operated successfully for nearly a decade. The most compelling evidence connected Mary and Carter to the death of a rancher named Henry Mitchell in Kansas during 1852. Mitchell had died from what appeared to be food poisoning, but a woman matching Mary's description had been seen in the area both before and after his death. Mitchell's modest estate had been inherited by a recently married wife who disappeared shortly after the funeral, taking with her all portable assets. Similar patterns emerged in Nebraska, Colorado Territory, and Nevada Territory. In each case, the deaths had been attributed to accident, illness, or natural causes. In each case, women associated with the victims had disappeared shortly afterward. And in several cases, a man matching Carter's description had been present in the community during the relevant time period. These discoveries transformed understanding of the Johnson-Carter case from an isolated frontier murder to evidence of what may have been the most successful serial killing operation in 19th century America. The implications were staggering. If the pattern was real, Mary and Carter may have been responsible for a dozen or more deaths over the course of their criminal partnership. But the evidence remained circumstantial. The deaths had occurred decades earlier, witnesses were dead or scattered, and official records from frontier territories were often incomplete or lost. Modern law enforcement techniques that might have established definitive connections between the cases did not exist, and the passage of time had made thorough investigation impossible. The story might have ended there, relegated to speculation among true crime enthusiasts and frontier historians. But in 1968, construction work in downtown Portland uncovered a metal box that had been buried beneath what had once been the basement of a boarding house. The box contained personal papers belonging to William Carter, papers that had apparently been hidden before his arrest and forgotten after his execution. Among these papers were detailed records of the couple's criminal activities, records that Carter had maintained with the same methodical precision that characterized their planning of individual crimes. The records documented 8 separate murders committed between 1851 and 1855, murders that had netted the couple nearly $15,000 in cash and valuables. The records also revealed the true scope of their deception. Mary and Carter had used multiple identities, traveling separately and reuniting only when necessary to plan and execute their crimes. They had maintained careful surveillance of potential victims, sometimes for months, before deciding whether to proceed. And they had developed sophisticated methods for disposing of assets and establishing new identities that allowed them to escape detection even when their crimes attracted official attention. Most chilling were Carter's personal observations about their victims, observations that revealed complete emotional detachment from the human cost of their actions. Carter described their targets as inventory and referred to the murders as transactions. His writings showed no evidence of guilt, remorse, or recognition that they were taking human lives. For Carter, murder was simply a business practice, an efficient method for acquiring assets owned by other people. Mary's role, as revealed in the hidden documents, was more complex than had been apparent during the trial. While Carter provided the technical expertise necessary for planning and executing the murders, Mary was responsible for intelligence gathering and target selection. She was also responsible for the psychological manipulation that allowed them to gain their victims' trust and access to their resources. The documents showed that Mary possessed an extraordinary ability to assess and exploit human weaknesses. She could identify lonely men, men with limited family connections, men whose disappearance would attract minimal attention. She could present herself as whatever type of woman would most appeal to a particular target, adapting her personality and background story to match their desires and expectations. Together, Mary and Carter had created what might be described as a murder factory, a systematic approach to killing that operated with industrial efficiency and generated consistent profits. Their success depended on careful preparation, patience, and the willingness to invest months or years in establishing the relationships necessary to gain access to their victims. The discovery of these records prompted law enforcement agencies in several states to reopen cold cases from the 1850s, hoping to find additional evidence of the couple's crimes. The investigations confirmed several of the deaths documented in Carter's records, but they also raised troubling questions about how many other victims might have been claimed by criminals whose methods were too sophisticated for frontier justice systems to detect. More broadly, the Johnson-Carter case forced historians and criminologists to reconsider assumptions about crime in frontier America. The popular image of frontier violence emphasized spontaneous conflicts, crimes of passion, and rough justice administered by vigilante groups. The systematic, premeditated nature of Mary and Carter's crimes suggested that frontier communities were vulnerable to forms of criminal enterprise that their informal justice systems were not equipped to address. Today, the Johnson-Carter case is studied in criminology programs as an early example of serial killing motivated by profit rather than psychological compulsion. Their methods anticipated techniques that would become common among organized crime groups in later periods, and their success demonstrated the vulnerability of communities that relied on trust and informal social controls to maintain order. The mine where Thomas Johnson died has long since been reclaimed by forest, marked only by subtle depressions in the earth where the tunnels have collapsed. The cemetery where Johnson is buried remains, though many of the wooden markers have rotted away and the identities of other victims have been lost to time. Johnson's stone monument, weathered by more than a century of mountain winters, still bears its simple inscription about murder and betrayal. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of the case lies not in physical memorials, but in its demonstration of how easily evil can masquerade as normalcy, how completely communities can be deceived by those who understand the vulnerabilities of human trust. In an age when we imagine ourselves protected by sophisticated law enforcement and communication systems, the story of Mary Johnson and William Carter serves as a reminder that the most dangerous criminals are often those who appear most ordinary, most trustworthy, most deserving of our confidence. And in the silence of abandoned mining camps and forgotten cemeteries, the question remains: how many other Thomas Johnsons died trusting the wrong people? How many other secrets lie buried in the vast spaces of the American frontier, waiting for time and chance to reveal the truth about those who chose murder as their path to prosperity? The answer, like the scattered bones of the frontier dead, may never be fully known.